Hey guys, tonight we wander through a land where gardens don't just grow. They float, flourish, and occasionally get someone fined for misaligned chili rows. Welcome to the surprisingly bureaucratic world of Aztec garden inspectors. Picture this: soft pink light slipping over Lake Xochimilco, mist curling above the surface like it's trying to keep a secret. You drift past rows of green beans and maize, the faint scent of damp soil mingling with the smoke from a distant copal incense burner. But just as you start to admire the glistening dew on a squash blossom, a man in feathered robes stops you with a disapproving grunt and a frown so sharp it could slice agave. He's not a priest. He's not a warrior. He's worse. He's a Tlamatini from the Garden Council, and your tomato plants are 2 fingers outside regulation spacing. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you're watching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge barefoot along the spongy, reed-lined pathways of a chinampa, a floating garden anchored with stakes and rich with soil dredged from the lakebed. Each rectangle is a marvel of ancient agricultural engineering, more efficient than many modern systems. But don't be fooled by the wild beauty of sunflowers nodding lazily in the breeze. There are rules here, so many rules. And the Aztecs? They keep receipts. In the distance, a man wearing a cloak patterned like butterfly wings scratches something into a bark paper scroll. He's part of the Tlacochcalcatl, the civil garden overseers appointed by the central Huey Tlatoani himself. His job? To monitor agricultural output, enforce planting schedules, and report any infractions, whether it's a lazy maize patch or a rebellious pumpkin vine doing its own thing. The Aztecs didn't just grow crops, they curated them like art. The Chinampas were required to grow specific crop rotations: maize, beans, squash, chili, and huitlacoche, a fungal delicacy that turns corn into what looks like alien popcorn but tastes like earthy heaven. If a farmer dared to mess with the cycle or plant a rogue cucumber, that could mean penalties, usually in the form of extra tribute, sometimes forced labor, and, in rare cases, being paraded in shame before the temple steps with a single corn husk as your only outfit. Yes, it was itchy. And then there was the spacing. Every plant had its place. Maize? Finger-width apart, with rows straight enough to impress a military general. Tomatoes? Not too close, or they'd anger Tlaloc, the rain god with a reputation for mood swings. Historians still argue whether these guidelines had a practical agricultural purpose or were more about spiritual geometry, pleasing the gods through symmetrical horticulture. Either way, you'd better hope your bean poles are aligned like Orion's belt. The inspectors weren't lone wolves either. They moved in pairs, one to observe, one to record. Because, of course, Aztec bureaucracy loved redundancy. Their scrolls were detailed, often illustrated with tiny glyphs that showed the farmer's face, the garden layout, and whether the chili plants had adequate shade. These reports were then taken to the central office in Tenochtitlan, where they were reviewed by a panel of older Tlamatinimae, wise men, who wore robes heavy with embroidered corn tassels and probably took themselves very seriously. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact. Tenochtitlan, the capital city, had a population of over 200,000 people at its peak, more than London at the same time. Feeding that many mouths required ruthless agricultural planning. It's no wonder that garden inspectors were treated almost like minor nobles. They even had a seal, an obsidian-stamped insignia they'd press into wax or clay to certify that a garden was compliant. But not everything was so tightly hemmed in. One fringe tidbit: some Chinampa farmers reportedly used crocodile dung as a natural pest repellent. Imagine getting flagged on your inspection scroll not for your crop spacing, but because your dung application was too enthusiastic. The scent alone could earn you a visit from the sanitation Kalpixk, household tax collectors. And yet, despite all the rules, it worked. The Chinampa system produced up to 7 harvests a year in some places. Each plot was a humming, blooming machine, overseen by gardeners who, beneath their wide hats and mud-caked tunics, carried the weight of entire tribute systems. Crops grown here didn't just feed families. They fed armies. They became offerings. They determined whether a neighboring city-state would get a friendly handshake or a full-scale invasion. The bureaucratic spiderweb extended beyond the gardens themselves. If a farmer needed more space, they had to submit a request through their local kalpuli, neighborhood council. That request had to be endorsed by a community elder, notarized with a maize kernel offering, and then passed up the ladder to the district's agricultural registrar. And gods forbid you skipped a step. That was how you ended up digging latrines in the temple district for a month. Still, there was a certain beauty to it all. Picture a humming world where everything, every chili pod, every splash of lake water, played a part in an elaborate civic dance. Bureaucracy wasn't just red tape here. It was a kind of religion. To plant well was to honor the gods. To break the rules wasn't just illegal, it was sacrilegious. And that's probably why the inspectors took their jobs so seriously. Sure, maybe one of them had a power complex because he wasn't picked to be a jaguar warrior. Maybe another liked to see farmers sweat while they tried to explain their composting ratios. But deep down, these garden watchers weren't just administrators. They were the empire's lifeline. Without them, the delicate balance of tribute, harvest, and divine approval could fall apart like a badly bound codex. So, next time you grumble about HOA rules or someone reporting your lawn to the city, imagine living under a system where forgetting to weed your squash might offend a god and cost you your roof. You shuffle forward, the reed mats beneath your feet growing slick with morning dew, as another inspector, this one with a slight limp and an alarming number of quetzal feathers, approaches with a sigh that sounds like he's already disappointed in you. His companion unfurls a bark paper scroll and starts sketching your poorly pruned amaranth bush with the sort of exaggerated frown usually reserved for tax evasion. It's hard not to feel judged by someone holding a stylus made of sharpened bone. What you've stumbled into now isn't just crop control, it's Aztec garden politics, tangled as a knot of morning glory vines after a rainstorm. By this point in your bureaucratic journey, you've learned the Chinampas aren't just floating farms, they're political chessboards. And garden inspectors? They're both pawns and power brokers, depending on whose maze they're measuring. Because here's the truth. The inspectors didn't only answer to the central government. They also had to dance carefully around local kalpuli leaders, ambitious nobles, and the odd high-ranking priest who liked his chilies extra spicy and exactly 12 per plot. In this world, checking for mildew wasn't just about healthy plants. It was a tightrope act of loyalty, bribery, and quiet threats whispered between rows of beans. And yes, there were bribes. You see, some farmers, especially the wealthier ones with connections, could grease the reeds a bit, offering gifts of cacao, embroidered cloaks, or the ever-popular roasted duck with honey. It wasn't officially allowed, of course, but when you're an overworked inspector with 10 more plots to audit before noon, and a farmer hands you a warm tamale with that just pretend you didn't see the illegal avocados look in his eyes, well, you might accidentally misplace a report or forget to check that irrigation channel. But corruption came with consequences. If another inspector reported you, or worse, if a failed harvest linked back to your negligence, things could spiral fast. At best, you'd be publicly shamed, your feather cloak revoked, your stylus snapped in half. At worst, well, let's just say the Aztecs had a very dramatic HR department. There are records of inspectors who were marched up temple steps for a retraining session that involved a bit too much blood for anyone's comfort. Still, it wasn't always so grim. Sometimes it was just ridiculous. One preserved codex shows a complaint filed by a noble over the offensive crookedness of a neighbor's bean trellis, which, apparently, offended the harmony of the entire district. And guess what? A council was convened. Witnesses were called. The crooked trellis was measured, discussed, and ultimately ordered to be corrected, under threat of being struck from the records of divine alignment. You can't make this stuff up. Well, maybe a little, but the core is real. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact for this section. The Aztecs had an incredibly detailed tribute system documented in the Codex Mendoza, which shows exactly how much produce each region owed, down to the cacao bean. These tributes were logged and reviewed, and guess who was often tasked with verifying the physical goods matched the quotas? That's right, the garden inspectors. They weren't just field workers, they were walking Excel spreadsheets with ceremonial headdresses. This level of record-keeping gave them a unique power. If a farmer fell short on tribute, the inspector could document it, and the ripple effect would be felt across the empire. Miss your squash quota. That affects the offerings at the temple of Huitzilopochtli. No offerings? No blessings. No blessings? Rain doesn't come. Rain doesn't come? Entire provinces revolt. So yeah, no pressure or anything. But perhaps the strangest wrinkle in all this was the way some inspectors used botany reports as, well, revenge letters. There are fringe accounts, half legend, half bureaucratic fan fiction, of inspectors who would falsify reports to settle old scores. One tale tells of an inspector who, after being snubbed at a feast, claimed an entire harvest of tomatoes was cursed by cloud spirits. The result? The farmer's family lost their land, and the inspector allegedly walked away with a very smug smile and a cart full of reallocated chili paste. Of course, historians still argue whether these tales were embellishments or real examples of how deeply the bureaucracy was interwoven with interpersonal drama. But considering how passionate the Aztecs were about appearances, ritual, and social hierarchy, it wouldn't be surprising. These weren't just bean counters, they were enforcers of cosmic order. Now, let's take a quiet stroll through the inspector headquarters in Tenochtitlan. You walk up steps made of volcanic stone, past rows of bundled maize tribute wrapped in woven reeds, and into a room thick with the scent of crushed flour ink. Here, senior inspectors sit cross-legged, reviewing scrolls by torchlight. They whisper over glyphs and numerical counts, adjusting quotas, debating whether a region's low squash yield is due to weather or just bad gardening. Their walls are lined with rows of inventory, dried herbs, seed samples, records bound in deer hide, and the occasional offering, like a hummingbird carcass or a polished obsidian knife, just in case discussions get intense. One of the senior scribes tilts his head at your scroll and raises an eyebrow that communicates both suspicion and mild disdain. You did, after all, allow unauthorized cucumbers. That's a write-up. And while we're being thorough, let's not forget the training schools. Yes, The Aztecs had those too. Young nobles studying to become agricultural overseers spent years learning not just about crops and calendars, but also how to interpret omens in rainfall patterns and determine the best day to inspect a field based on celestial alignments. It was part science, part religion, and part, well, let's be honest, performance art. You weren't just evaluating plant health. You were upholding divine will with the same seriousness most people reserve for Supreme Court rulings. As your inspection wraps up, you're given a single maguey thorn, symbolic of a minor violation. A full-blown punishment would have involved more thorns and possibly a public speech delivered by someone in a feathered mask. But for now, your improperly mulched zucchini is just a warning. You walk away through the misty canals, the sound of frogs blending with distant temple drums. Behind you, the inspectors disappear into the maze rows, their scrolls tucked under one arm, already murmuring about the next inspection. A noble's garden rumored to be growing unauthorized cacao. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, that in the heart of this ancient empire, civilization didn't just rise on the backs of warriors and kings. It thrived because someone, somewhere, was making sure the chili plants grew straight. The amaranth was harvested on time, and no one tried to pass off moldy corn as tribute. Because in the Aztec world, even paradise had paperwork, and now the night deepens. The mist that once floated above the chinampas settles gently along your arms and shoulders like a soft shawl. The croak of frogs grows fainter, and the scent of damp earth begins to blend into something more distant, more dreamlike. The inspectors have vanished. Their feathers, their scrolls, even their judgments, dissolving into memory like footsteps in the mud after rain. All that remains is the slow lap of water against wooden docks, the quiet hush of wind sifting through maize stalks, and the far-off rustle of reed huts falling asleep one by one. You lean back. Let your mind drift gently, like a boat on still waters. The heavy rhythm of bureaucracy gives way to the natural rhythm of the lake. Calm, even, timeless. And in that stillness, you begin to sense what the Aztecs might have felt as they looked across their miraculous gardens, that for all the rules and reports and rituals, something beautiful had bloomed in the mud, something worth protecting. So, with that image of flowers growing straight, of beans curling up trellises in sacred alignment, of ancient hands tracing lines in bark paper by firelight, let yourself settle. The story may end here, but your breath continues in slow waves, syncing with the ancient beat of water, leaf, and sky. You're safe. You're grounded. And somewhere in the quiet corners of your imagination, a garden inspector is finally taking the night off.